Let me tell you something that should genuinely terrify anyone paying attention to global finance right now. Four of the wealthiest nations on Earth, countries that have poured hundreds of billions into American markets, are actively discussing whether to yank every single dollar back home. And nobody seems to be talking about it. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar. These aren't adversaries. These aren't hostile powers looking to damage American interests. These are supposed to be Washington's closest partners in the Middle East. The same nations that rolled out the red carpet for Trump's visit to Riyadh. The same governments that signed investment pledges so massive they made international headlines for weeks. Now they're sitting in private rooms, running calculations on what happens if they simply withdraw from the American economy altogether. Have you stopped to actually think about what that means for your retirement account? For mortgage rates? For the entire financial system that Americans depend on every single day? Here's what keeps me up at night about this situation. We're not witnessing some diplomatic spat that gets resolved over dinner. We're watching something far more dangerous unfold. A fundamental breakdown in trust between America and the very allies who have bankrolled its military presence across the entire Gulf region for decades. These countries host American bases. They purchase American weapons by the billions. Their sovereign wealth funds own stakes in everything from Manhattan skyscrapers to Silicon Valley startups. And right now, they feel completely and utterly betrayed. The reason behind this potential economic divorce is straightforward once you understand it. These Gulf monarchies are absorbing devastating Iranian attacks on their cities, their infrastructure, their economic crown jewels. Not because they chose to enter this conflict, not because anyone asked their opinion, but simply because American military assets sit on their soil. They're paying the price for a war they never approved, never endorsed, and weren't even warned about before the first missiles flew. Let me walk you through the actual financial architecture here, because the scale of Gulf investment in America is something most people drastically underestimate. The 7 major sovereign wealth funds operating out of the Gulf region controlled enough capital in 2025 to account for 43% of all state investor deployments worldwide. Nearly half of all sovereign wealth fund activity on the planet flows through these Gulf institutions. In a single year, these funds pushed $126 billion into global markets. That figure was recorded before any of the current crisis began, before Iranian missiles started raining down on Dubai, before refineries went offline, before data centers caught fire. That was the baseline level of capital these nations were moving around the world when things were relatively calm. The relationship between America and these Gulf states has never been purely about security. The connection runs far deeper than most Americans realize. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar have embedded themselves into the very fabric of American economic life. Their sovereign funds hold positions in commercial real estate across every major American city. They've poured billions into technology companies that Americans use every single day. Infrastructure projects, private equity firms, investment vehicles of every conceivable variety. The Qatar Investment Authority made headlines when it backed Jared Kushner's fund. The Abu Dhabi Investment Authority maintains positions across American financial markets so extensive that unwinding them would require years of careful maneuvering. These aren't casual investors. These are structural pillars of the American financial system. And these same institutions are now reviewing whether the entire relationship needs to be reconsidered from the ground up. Multiple verified sources have confirmed that withdrawal discussions are actively underway in Gulf capitals. To truly grasp why these governments have reached this breaking point, you need to understand what they've been forced to endure since February 28th. Since Iranian counter-operations began, these 4 nations have been transformed into active combat zones. Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Doha, Kuwait City, some of the most modern, most economically sophisticated cities anywhere in the world. Now they're tracking incoming ballistic missiles and scrambling air defenses constantly. The UAE alone has been forced to intercept 165 ballistic missiles. Add to that 2 cruise missiles and 541 drones. Kuwait faced 97 ballistic missiles and 283 drones. Qatar dealt with 10 missiles and multiple drone systems. And these figures only represent what was successfully stopped. They don't account for what actually got through. In the Emirates, 35 drones successfully penetrated the country's sophisticated defensive systems. The Emirati Defense Ministry publicly acknowledged material damage across multiple locations. Fires erupted in Dubai. Structural damage occurred near the iconic Burj Al Arab. Explosions rocked sections of Abu Dhabi. And then came the detail that made analysts worldwide pause in genuine disbelief. A fire broke out inside an Amazon Web Services data center located in Dubai. This may constitute the first time in modern history that a major cloud infrastructure facility has sustained damage during an active military conflict. The implications are staggering. Data sovereignty questions suddenly became extremely practical. Cloud reliability assumptions that underpinned billions in investment decisions now require complete reassessment. Saudi Arabia absorbed its own devastating blow when Iranian strikes took the Ras Tanura refinery offline. Ras Tanura stands among the largest petroleum processing complexes anywhere on Earth. It represents a crown jewel of Saudi Aramco's production architecture. When Ras Tanura goes dark, price signals ripple through commodity markets and reach every oil-importing nation on the planet within hours. Qatar experienced consequences that the entire world felt immediately. Qatar Energy was forced to completely suspend liquefied natural gas production following the strikes. Qatar holds the position of world's largest LNG exporter. After Russian gas supplies to Europe were severed, Qatar became the energy lifeline, keeping European economies functioning. The suspension of Qatari production triggered a historic price surge on global gas markets. Natural gas prices across Europe jumped 66% in a single week. For European households still recovering from the previous energy crisis, that number represents a direct economic shock of extraordinary magnitude. The aviation dimension tells its own devastating story. More than 70% of all flights into the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain remained canceled following initial Iranian operations. Dubai International Airport, handling approximately 95 million travelers annually, essentially ceased functioning. Stock markets in Qatar and Saudi Arabia collapsed in the immediate aftermath. Exchanges in the UAE and Kuwait suspended trading entirely. That represents the economic bill from just the first week of a conflict these governments never chose. And that bill grows larger with every passing day. For these Gulf states, the current crisis threatens their entire economic model across three distinct dimensions. The first involves direct revenue destruction. Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi have spent 2 decades constructing global identities as premier centers of innovation, investment, and connectivity. These are sophisticated economies that successfully attracted international capital, talent, and tourism by offering stability and predictability. When Dubai International Airport grinds to a standstill, it represents a direct attack on the foundational value proposition of the entire economic model. Every canceled flight chips away at confidence. Every evacuated corporate headquarters signals danger. The second dimension involves reputational damage that proves exceptionally difficult to repair. Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia have made enormous strategic bets on connectivity and reliability as their bridge to a post-petroleum future. The Vision 2030 framework invested hundreds of billions into positioning themselves for a world that relies less on fossil fuels. All these initiatives rest on a single premise: that these countries are safe, stable places to invest and operate. Active conflict zone status corrodes that premise in ways that persist long after the immediate crisis passes. The third dimension involves the destruction of regional diplomatic architecture. The Gulf had spent years building a carefully calibrated framework of tension management with Iran. In 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran restored full diplomatic relations after 7 years of hostility. Qatar and Iran share the South Pars gas field and maintained a pragmatic working relationship. Oman served as a trusted mediator between Washington and Tehran. All of that accumulated diplomatic capital was incinerated within days, without any of these governments being consulted. These countries had signed contractual commitments of enormous scale, military procurement agreements worth tens of billions, investment pledges in American infrastructure and technology. Saudi Arabia announced commitments of several $100 billion during Trump's Riyadh visit in 2025. These commitments were made on an implicit understanding that the security relationship with Washington provided protection and stability. That understanding has been shattered. The withdrawal logic follows inevitably. These governments are absorbing enormous costs for a military operation they never requested and received no warning about. Their initial frustration was overtaken by something deeper. The anger of watching Iranian missiles strike their own cities as a direct consequence of hosting American military assets in a conflict Washington decided to initiate without their consent. But here lies the cruel paradox. On one side, the Iranian strikes have temporarily pulled them closer to Washington. American air defense systems are actively protecting Gulf airspace. On March 1st, 5 Gulf Cooperation Council states joined the United States in condemning Iranian operations. They are not breaking with Washington entirely. But on the other side, they are absorbing a mounting economic bill for a conflict they do not control and cannot exit. The investment withdrawal threat represents a precisely calibrated economic signal delivered in the only language that produces policy recalibration in Washington, the language of direct financial consequence. Maritime transport through the Strait of Hormuz has been severely disrupted. Approximately 30% of the world's seaborne crude oil trade transits through that passage. Nearly 20% of global LNG supply moves through the same choke point. Numerous vessels currently sit anchored outside the strait. Shipping operators have decided to avoid the passage entirely rather than accept the risk premium. These disruptions have pushed Brent crude prices from roughly $70 to over $80 per barrel within days. If Saudi production capacity remains degraded, if Qatar does not resume LNG output, analysts are projecting $120, $130, even $150 per barrel. For Trump specifically, this trajectory creates an existential political problem. He campaigned on bringing American energy prices down dramatically. The midterm elections of November 2026 are less than 9 months away. Every additional dollar at the pump represents a direct, politically attributable cost that voters will feel immediately. Iran's strategic design in targeting Gulf infrastructure is precisely calibrated to exploit this vulnerability. For Tehran, striking Dubai generates greater economic impact than targeting isolated military installations. Dubai possesses incomparable international resonance. A fire in a Dubai data center generates immediate market reactions and international news coverage. Tehran is calculating that the economically devastating consequences of its Gulf retaliations will generate sufficient pressure on Gulf monarchies to push those governments to pressure Washington toward a ceasefire. The mechanism being played out represents a precisely designed pressure cascade. The investment withdrawal threat represents the Gulf's formal entry into that cascade. Their message is unambiguous. If you will not manage the consequences Iran is imposing on our economies, we will impose comparable consequences on yours. If this withdrawal actually materializes, 3 realistic scenarios exist. The first involves a partial withdrawal serving primarily as a political signal. Gulf governments suspend certain forward investment commitments, freeze pending contracts, redirect some sovereign fund flows toward non-American destinations. The immediate financial impact would be more symbolic than catastrophic, but the political signal would be powerful and difficult for Washington to ignore. The second scenario involves sustained reallocation of sovereign fund capital away from American assets. If 20 to 30% of Gulf capital flows are systematically redirected away from American Treasury bonds, real estate, and equity markets, the effects ripple through the American financial system. Reduced demand for Treasury bonds pushes yields higher. Higher yields increase the cost of servicing the national debt. Those higher borrowing costs cascade through mortgage markets and consumer credit. The third scenario, complete rupture of military procurement contracts, remains least probable but carries the most devastating implications. Saudi Arabia and the UAE rank among the largest purchasers of American defense equipment worldwide. A comprehensive cancellation would generate immediate job losses in American defense manufacturing and undermine production programs that depend on international orders. There is one additional dimension that Washington has almost certainly not modeled adequately. China. More than 38% of Chinese crude oil imports originate from the Middle East. China maintains structural interest in rapid regional stabilization. But China simultaneously possesses profound strategic interest in exploiting this moment to deepen economic relationships with Gulf partners seeking to reduce dependence on the American-centered architecture. If Gulf sovereign wealth funds begin redirecting capital flows away from the United States, Beijing stands positioned to absorb a significant share. That capital reorientation would deepen financial integration between China and the Gulf at exactly the moment when American influence faces its most serious test in decades. What this situation reveals is something political leaders consistently underestimate. In the contemporary world, military power and economic power cannot be managed independently. You cannot conduct large-scale military operations in a region as economically central as the Gulf without generating economic consequences that feed back into the political sustainability of the operation itself. Trump himself stated publicly that Iranian retaliatory operations against Gulf countries had been probably the biggest surprise of the operation. That statement reveals more than intended. If Washington's characterization of devastating Allied strikes is surprise, it means this scenario was not in the operational planning. The economic feedback loops were not adequately modeled. When economic scenarios aren't in the plan, allies who pay the unplanned bill eventually stop waiting for Washington to acknowledge the problem. They start taking unilateral action to protect their own interests. The Gulf investment withdrawal threat represents precisely that kind of unilateral action. It emerges from allies who were not consulted, who are experiencing consequences they did not choose, and who have identified an economic lever sufficiently powerful to force conversation that diplomatic channels have not produced. What is being negotiated extends beyond military outcomes. The real negotiation concerns the price that Washington's Gulf partners are willing to continue paying for an operation they never voted for. That price increases every day that the current trajectory continues without a credible path toward de-escalation. How did we arrive at a situation where America's closest economic partners are openly discussing financial retaliation against Washington? The answer reveals something troubling about how decisions get made during moments of crisis. The Gulf states aren't acting from emotion alone. They're responding rationally to a situation where they bear enormous costs but possess no voice in determining outcomes. What happens over the coming weeks will determine whether the Gulf-American partnership emerges damaged but functional or fundamentally transformed in ways that reduce American influence for a generation. The sovereign wealth funds controlling hundreds of billions will be watching closely for signs that Washington understands the severity of the situation. The stakes extend beyond the immediate military conflict. They encompass the entire architecture of American relationships across the Middle East. They touch questions of energy security affecting every American consumer. They involve the future trajectory of great power competition with China. And they concern whether alliances built over decades can survive a single catastrophic miscalculation about what partners are willing to tolerate. The situation continues evolving rapidly. Understanding the full architecture of interests and pressures provides the only reliable foundation for anticipating where events ultimately lead. The Gulf investment withdrawal threat isn't the end of this story. It's potentially just the beginning of a much larger realignment in global economic relationships. The allies are watching. The adversaries are watching. And the sovereign wealth funds controlling trillions in aggregate capital are making calculations that will determine capital flows for years to come.